In 1942, my father was in the Navy and came home on leave and had a surprise for his family. I was 15. We were living in Massachusetts, and he says, we're moving to California. And I said, where the hell is that? So the next thing you know, we were on a train, my mother and my brother and sisters, and we ended up in San Diego. And I said, this is okay. And we were there about 6 months. My father says, we've transferred back to Boston again. And I said, not me. I'm a California guy.
Welcome to Meet the Ocean. We are a nonprofit podcast that shares the saltwater stories of our planet. And I am your host, Paul North. Today is no ordinary episode. And technically, I'm not sure any of our episodes are ordinary. Because, well, I think you know the answer. Is because we funky. And our ocean conservation is interactive. We're trying to build something here. But this episode, the very one that is in your ear right now, is our 100th podcast. Cue the celebratory marine mammal cacophony of sound. All of this has been a 5-year journey for our nonprofit, and we would like to give great thanks to those who donated both big and small to help us along the way. In case you didn't hear, Meet the Ocean was nominated by the Webby Awards for a top 5 podcast in science and education, lining up our microphone stands with the likes of Neil deGrasse Tyson, CNN, and Duolingo. Additionally, our conservation film, Winter in Antarctica, continues to show around the world with 5 awards under its penguin suit. And just some weeks ago, the performers of the Nevada Rhythmic Academy, a group of 12 young women with unbelievable acrobatic talent who also featured in our film, lent their talents to Antarctic conservation once again, creating a human sculpture, a wave to signify the movement we have started in Las Vegas to perform for Antarctic conservation until it receives the marine protected areas it so desperately needs. In short time, this image will feature as a fundraiser for Meet the Ocean on our new website, which has a student art gallery, revolving monthly creature features, access to our film, and our Penguin Pen Pal program. You're going to want to check some of that out.
Find all the reasons to support our nonprofit at meettheocean.org.
Hello, everyone. I am the official spokespenguin of the Penguin Pen Pal program. If you would just follow me this way. As you can see, this is our writing room. All volunteers and several different species happily writing to children around the world. You would be amazed how often the topic of pizza comes up. Now I know what you're thinking. How can a penguin hold a pen? Well, you've got us. We can't. But the Penguin Typewriter program just doesn't have the same ring, does it? You know, a leopard seal heard that children were writing to us, and she got really excited and wanted to write a letter too. But she ended up eating all the paper, so it didn't really work out. Anyway, I'm hungry, so I'm gonna take a swim. Hope to hear from you soon.
And now, to continue our 100th podcast, featuring the legendary cameraman, Chuck Nicklin. Chuck Nicklin is an Emmy Award-winning cameraman and co-founder of San Diego's legendary Diving Locker, which introduced and instructed people on the underwater ways for more than 4 decades. A pioneer of underwater cinematography, his work on films include some of the greats, like The Abyss, The Deep, and even a couple of James Bond films like Never Say Never Again and For Your Eyes Only. Basically, if Sean Connery was underwater, Chuck was there with him.
Must be dreaming.
As far as I'm concerned, Chuck is one of the best I'll ever have on the microphone because he embodies the spirit and the history of modern man's interaction with the salt water. If you have ever put a tank on your back or brought a camera down below, then you, myself, and all the rest of us have to recognize the effort and effect this man has had on the industry. And so it was my great honor to be invited into Chuck's home to have this conversation. It is a story of a man's life, a man who is now in his 90s and is still getting in the water.
Then I was going to high school in San Diego, and some of the guys had cars. I didn't have a way of getting around, but one of the guys says, we go down to Sunset Cliffs and look at the water and the tide pools. And I said, I want to go. Can I go? And I discovered the water. The next thing I knew, I had found a way out to La Jolla Cove, and there was a Navy man who'd just come back from Japan, and the war was over now. Now I'm in the Navy in 1945, 46. And this gentleman was there with his wife and child and a blanket with a funny-looking thing on, and then I just decided that's a way to get a look in the water. And so I asked him if I could borrow his mask, and I was in La Jolla Cove and swam out off of La Jolla Cove, and the first little reef rock I saw, I said, wow, and dived down, and there was a Garibaldi and a lobster, and I says, I have a new way of life. That is actually how I started diving, and I had a friend that had access to 2 tanks and a mask or 2, and we went diving in our bathing suits off of Bird Rock in the cold water and became scavengers for abalone and lobster, and all the time my lifestyle ended up spearfishing, which is not a thing that is very popular these days, but that was the way you dived in those days, and I became a spearfisherman and met members of the Bottom Scratchers, one of the first dive groups in the world, I guess. I was really some of the first divers. So I became a diver and met some people, and met a fellow named Conrad Limbaugh, who was one of the first scientific divers of Scripps, and met him and other people from that group at Scripps. And one day they said, well, there's a group of us who have been doing scientific diving off of Point Loma in San Diego, and they have accumulated some money and would like to start a dive business. And there was one dive business in San Diego at that time. They said, there's an opportunity here, and we want to dive so we can mix our scientific diving with sport diving. And they're all sport divings on the side, that's what people did. And they asked if I could join their group, and they would like to start this diving business. And we started a sport diving operation, but with a sidekick of doing some scientific in the back room. And gradually the scientific part disappeared and became a serious diving business. This was 1959 when we opened the diving locker in Pacific Beach in San Diego. An interesting time to start a diving business because we opened on the 15th of June in 1959. And on the 14th of June in 1959, they had the only shark death in San Diego in history. And this was the day before our business opened, and it was very quiet for a while.
I can imagine. In terms of what scuba diving was back then, I don't think people have a notion of how the equipment evolved. So when you were first getting in the water, what type of gear were you using?
When I first started diving, was actually the first started diving when I borrowed that mask from the veteran that had come back from Japan and started exploring the idea of making my own equipment of some kind. I had a relative that had been in the Navy and had a pair of fins. And I found that they were still selling some dive masks in L.A. in a dive shop. So I had mask and fins. And that's all you had, and a bathing suit. And gradually ended up with a group of people at Convair that started a dive club called the Convair Dive Club. So then I had a friend that was diving or starting to dive, and he and I used to go diving primarily for lobsters and abalone. That's the way it all started. But that's when I met some of the people from Scripps, and then evolved into the Scientific Diving Consultants, which was the group of the people that I'd accumulated in my diving experiences, and the guys from scientists from Scripps, all mostly graduate students. Andy Recktenster, one of the great explorers of the undersea, and Conrad Limbaugh. Jim Stewart was the head of the diving operation at Scripps for a long, long time. And people that were really into diving and had their backing to help me with this diving business. Ron Church was one of the early divers in San Diego that was really interested in diving and was one of the top underwater photographers in the early days. And he and I had this operation together with the support of the Scientific Divers, a group of really scientific diving from the Institution of Oceanography.
I think that is such a fascinating time to be exploring in the way that you did, because to some degree you were making it up as you went.
Yeah. Well, and we scrounged some rubber suit material from Rubitex and started building wetsuits. First diving suits that were used in sport diving was really pearly rubber suits, and then Rubitex came up with foam rubber, and then we started building wetsuits, and that became the basis of our company for a long time. With the diving locker, we had this basic amount of financial backing. We had just enough to rent this building in Pacific Beach on Cass Street and buy a compressor. So we had a way to pump air, which is very, very few people had in those days. It was the guys that knew what was going on, or Connie Limbaugh and Jim Stewart and Andy Reckner, so the guys I mentioned, were involved in helping me start a diving classes. And we were teaching some of the first classes of divers that wanted to dive as sport divers, and the group of people that were scientists. And it all worked together in one building with a little bit of money and a good compressor. And we were off on the diving locker. And the diving locker existed for the next 40, 50 years and was my lifestyle.
The diving locker is a place of legend. It's not just a place where people learned how to dive, but it developed a culture. And to be a part of that must bring back such great memories for you.
Yeah, and we had the pool across the street. This was an exciting time because people were just learning how to dive. There were a lot of divers, and the guys from the bottom scratches and all of us young people that were free diving, we were using mast fins, snorkels, and gradually after we started the diving locker, we discovered Rubitex and we started building wetsuits so people had more extended time. But the start of the diving classes, and we were teaching classes at the Mission Beach Plunge and doing teaching classes anywhere where we could find a pool. And it made a whole new sport and gave me an opportunity to learn photography, or to get into photography. And I had a little plastic box with a brownie in it that I'd fooled around with. But when I became friends with the guys at Scripps, some of these people had some equipment. They had Rolling Marine, which was one of the basic cameras that the early photographers started with. Anyway, I had a chance to dive with Ron Church, and Ron Church had a rollie, and we'd go out and we'd dive, and you could only take 12 pictures, so we'd take turns making dives and each get 6 pictures, then go back and we'd develop them in the back of the diving locker and decide what we'd done right and what we'd done wrong. And one of the unfortunate things in my early days of diving was Connie Limbaugh and I became very good friends. And Connie Limbaugh went to France to dive with the French divers and was lost in a cave. And he got confused and went the wrong way in the cave and was drowned, of course. One of the things that he had was a Rollie Marine in the housing, and his wife, Nan Limbaugh, said, "You can have Connie's Rollie Marine if you'd like it." And I said, "Yeah." And Connie had been working with a fellow in San Diego to develop a housing for a 16-millimeter camera. And this guy says, "Well, you want to use this camera?" And so all of a sudden, I had a diving business. I had the urge to be an underwater photographer, and I had a 16-millimeter camera and a professional still camera in my hands, and I was off and running. So the guys at Scripps had a connection with National Geographic, and National Geographic wanted pictures of gray whales underwater, of course. And fortunately, just in the earliest days of the diving locker, some friends of mine were going diving off La Jolla and found a gray whale trapped in a net. The net was over its tail. And everybody says, "Wow, watch that. And let's go diving." And they were on our way. And I said, "Wait a minute. I want to swim over there and see what's happening." So I swam over there and took pictures of the gray whale, and other divers went with me and took the camera and took pictures of me with the gray whale, releasing the whale from the rope looped over its flukes. All of a sudden, I was a gray whale specialist. I was a specialist in gray whale diving. I knew nothing about it. I just lucked out by being on the right place at the right time. And so National Geographic wanted to do this story on gray whales, and they had their photographer contact me. And we went out and explored up and down the coast, went to Mexico and on Geographic's budget, and didn't have very good luck with the gray whales. And the gray whales were, nobody knew much about them in those days. And so Geographic all of a sudden had heard about this guy that was swimming around with the trapped whale, and we released it, and it was a story. It came out in the newspapers. It was in all over Europe, everywhere. It was published about this guy swimming with a whale and saving the whale. And they sent Bates Little Whales out to their underwater photographer, it was still pretty basic in those days. And Bates and I just hit it off. We were just became good friends and spent a lot of time for a month or so chasing gray whales without much success. But then Bates had to do an assignment in the Bahamas on sailboats. And in the process, he fell and broke his leg. He talked about hiring me to go with him as an assistant to Turkey to do a film. And he called me and said, "Chuck, we're going to Turkey. I've signed you on. You and I are going to go to Turkey and do a Geographic story." And I said, "All right, Bates." And he called about a week later and said, "Chuck, I've just fallen and broken my leg, and I can't do the job in Turkey." And I said, "Bates, it's okay. We'll do something again sometime." And he said, "But they want you to go and do the story." And that was my first Geographic story, and gave me input to not only Geographic stories that I did with a bunch of the other photographers, both on my own or with them. And all of a sudden, I was stumbling into doing a 16-millimeter film. And they had a film that they needed to be shot in San Diego, and they didn't have a Hollywood photographer. They had one photographer that was really the hot photographer and in doing the underwater stuff. And they needed somebody just to do this one series in San Diego. So they contacted me, and I said, "Oh, I can do that." Actually, it was a big 35 millimeter housing about the size of a steamer trunk set on end. And I went down to the boat to meet the topside photographer that would run the shoot. And he showed me this camera, and I just gulped a lot and said, "Oh my God, what have I got into him?" And it was a film about one of the actors had fallen into the net of a fishing boat. It was full of sharks, and somebody had to go jump in there and save him. I had to film him going in and the other guy jumping in, and I had to do the film with this giant camera. Camera was so big and it was slightly heavy, and I had to swim with this camera and hang on to the camera in the net until they come in and help me, because I would have just sunk down too far with it. Anyways, another story. But it was that was my first really Hollywood film. Everything in the underwater film business, and probably business period, everything is dependent on connections. But if you get the connection and you can't do the job, the connection's done. And I fortunately had the experience just from sport diving and stuff so that I could do the job. And one led to another, and then it led to my friend Al Giddings. And Al Giddings was the man in underwater photography in those days. He didn't know much about it, more about it than I did. But he had a diving business that was making little like homemade cameras, housings, and said, "Chuck, I want you to go with me to the Cozumel. I'm going to make a film." And I said, "Okay, what do we know about making a film?" He says, "We're going to learn." And we went off to Cozumel, and we were both pretty good divers because we've been doing this hard freediving stuff for a long time. Well, I mean, a long time in those days was a few years anyway. But and we pulled off this film, and it was made for one of the diving companies, and that gave us again connections. You know, Al and I became great friends, and he was really into the production of films, and I had a family, and I had other commitments, and I had the diving business, so it all worked out that Al Giddings, and he's probably the most famous of the Hollywood underwater photographers from those days, and Al and I hit it off, and I had the relationship with different people that would help. Al was hardcore, got to go, and he needed somebody that knew what was going on, that could also handle the crew, could relate to other people besides the fact that we have to get this film. Anyway, Al Giddings is another story, and we did films all over the world for a long time. And Al would call me and say, "Chuck, I finally sold this idea, and we're going to go next week. Can you go?" And I said, "Sure." And I'd tell the guys at the diving locker, "Okay, I'm going to be gone for a couple of months. And I had a manager that did a good job, and I was gone. And I remember coming back from shooting in Polynesia somewhere, and going to the diving locker, and I was all tan, and I just bought a brand new blue Porsche, and I drove up and walked in the door, and there's a kid was standing there who was now one of the famous underwater photographers also. But Howard Hall was working for us as a photographer, as a dive master. And I walked in, and this kid was standing on the ladder cleaning the windows, those big glass windows. And I said, "Hey, boy, be careful you don't fall. You're going to break those windows. Those windows are really expensive." And that was my step in. He didn't know who I was. I owned the place, but I'd been off being a hero.
So I heard that you filmed a James Bond movie.
Yeah.
Where did that take place?
Oh, in the Bahamas. I worked on the James Bond film For Your Eyes Only with Al Gidding. And most of the films had a number of underwater photographers. Most of them didn't know what they're doing anyway. But Al and I just sort of took over, and it helped our relationship and built our reputation as Hollywood kind of shooters. In those days, not many people were shooting underwater and on a Hollywood kind of basis, and there weren't many options for that anyway. So in my situation, Al would work hard at putting together these films, and I'd go back and raise family and run the diving locker. And then I'd get a call, and Al would say, "Hey, I've got another film going. Can you go?" And I'd say, "Sure." And we'd be off to Tahiti or somewhere, and then I'd come back, and it'd be all curly haired and bronze, and pop in and start in the diving business again.
Because I'm a very large James Bond fan myself.
Oh, are you?
So how was it interacting with Sean Connery? Was he good in the water?
He's a nice guy. Yeah. Yeah, we did another shoot. I forget which film it is. Another one, because a lot of times on these films, you just have a situation where they just fly you in. I did a number of those where you don't get much credit, but you're the guy that gets the shot of the guy falling into the pool or whatever that is. And so I did some of those, and I did one on with Sean Connery. I forget the name of the film, but it was a Sean Connery film, and we had a little boat anchored off of this cave, and we're working in this cave and doing this thing. And when I come out of the water, his hairdresser had lost her earring, and she'd lost it, and the boat was anchored fore and aft, so we couldn't move the boat for filming. And she said, "I lost my earring," and Sean Connery says, "Oh, Chuck will get it for you." So I jumped in the water and went down under the boat, maybe 10 feet or something, and here's the earring. And so you would never find an earring in the sand. It just wouldn't happen. I mean, I didn't even expect to. I jumped in and said, "Well, if the boss wants me to do it," and she's a cute kid anyway. So anyway, that's one of the Sean Connery stories. But and another time we were underwater, and he wasn't into the underwater too much. We had a sled, and he had to drive this sled into this cave. And we got all set up, and Al was on one side. Al would usually get the long shot, and I'd get the tight shot. And we're all set up with two cameras and everything, and we look at Sean, and his mask is all cloudy. And Al says, "What do we do? We can't shoot it. You got to see." I mean, the only reason we're there is to see Sean Connery. And I said, "Okay." And I got Sean and tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Come on, and we could swim up this cave. You could get your head out of the water." And I said, "You're not going to like this, but give me your mask." And I took his mask and I spit in it and washed it around. And I gave it back to him. And he said, "Okay." I put it on his face, and we went down and we got the shot, and the mask stayed clear. And I became his friend on the boat from then on. Anything. "Hey, make room for Chuck over there. He wants to sit down." So it was interesting.
I wanted to ask, the first photograph I ever saw of you was on the back of the whale, a very famous photograph.
Oh, yeah.
And how did the animal react to you helping it?
The animal was caught by the flukes, and he could take a breath and come to the surface and breathe for a little bit. And then he'd dive, and he could dive down, but he couldn't get the flukes underwater because of the tangle with the buoys and stuff. Everybody says, "Well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do?" I said, "I don't know, get out of the way." And I swam over there, and it was, the flukes were like this, and the rope went over like that. So the rope was pulling like that. I just pulled it off of one side, and it slid off the other side, and the whale was free. And everybody's saying, "Oh, yeah." There's 2 or 3 guys in the water by then, and because they knew the whale was harmless. And the whale swam away, and then he made a dive, and he come up, and he went through a spout, and then swam around and blew a couple times and then just disappeared. And we were convinced that the whale was thanking me for undoing his from this heavy net.
So this amazing career also brought you down to the bottom of our planet, and you were talking to me about diving underneath the ice. What was that experience like?
Well, we were there to make a film, and it was part of a film. Al and I did a film where we went all around the world shot 5 one-hour segments, and part of it was under the ice in the Antarctic. When we first got there to the Antarctic, they didn't have a vehicle. They have vehicles like huts. They drive out over the ice and they drill a hole and put the vehicle over the ice. And then you could get dressed in and out of the vehicle, go into the water and make your dive and come back and get undressed, and it was pretty good. They didn't have a vehicle ready for us, and we had a budget, and we said we could go. So the first couple of dives we made, cutting ice, cutting a hole through the ice and diving and dressing in the vehicle. It was really tough. And then finally they gave us a hut, and we could drag it out over the ice and drill a hole, a pre-hole drill, and dive comfortably. But it was my first diving I'd been diving up in Alaska, but my first diving under like 6 foot of ice or more, and it was exciting. And I've had a couple situations where Al and I had worked on films where there was something happened where I just had to take over the whole thing, and this was one of them, because Al somehow cut his dry suit, and the water came in, and his leg was freezing. They had to get him out of the water, and he didn't have another suit there that he could dive, so it was my job to dive on this one shot. And it was a really good shot where the seal kept coming around me, and it was pretty nice.
Oh, that's amazing.
One time we were doing a white sharks with a circle vision. This is a big camera that has 7 cameras and shoots 360 degrees. And Al really wanted to be part of the top side part of the circle vision camera. We moved the net, the cage, over by the side of the boat so we could lower the circle vision camera right outside of the cage, because we had a couple of really big sharks that we didn't want to be out of the cage. So Al was going to put the housing together, a lot of bolts and screws and stuff, and we had a crew from the film company that was in charge of it. So he's helping them, but Al wanted to be part of this thing. So the deal was that they'd put the cage in the water and they dropped the camera down in front of me, and the whole thing went bad. And the camera started to leak. The first time it leaked, it had 7 cameras, 35 millimeter cameras in the container, and we had me in the cage, dropping the cage down lower because the camera was sinking because it was leaking. And I come up to fight my way up to the top, and my camera and his camera, because he was going to get in later, and I got to the top yelling, "Everything's going to hell! The camera's sinking! Get me out of here! Get me!" And they thought I was getting eaten or something, but it was an interesting situation. I don't know how I get into that, but
Well, you are certainly an inspiration to many, and the reason I'm here is because I'm friends with your son Flip, who has turned out to be quite an underwater photographer himself. So I'm curious on how you sort of guided him. Did you have a philosophy, or was it just come on, get in the water and keep up?
Yeah, it was sort of like that. The first pictures Flip took underwater that were any good at all was one of my 35 millimeter cameras that he was using, and he went with Base Little Hells and I at the Coronados, and he shot some pictures, and they were pretty good. He was diving, of course, as a diving instructor and all that, and all of a sudden he he said, this is what I'm going to do. His pictures come out okay, and Bates and Flip hit it off well, too. So Bates kept sending him invitations for ideas and stuff, contact him. I had a shoot in Hawaii on humpback whales, and Flip went along and as an assistant, and he was sort of shooting some stills on his own, but basically he was here to make sure I didn't drown. And the camera was pretty big and pretty heavy. So, but after the shoot, Flip took his slides of 35 millimeter whales and went to Geographic and talked to Bob Gilko, Bob Gilko was the leader at that time, and he had a big picture of a big mean gorilla on his office door, and that's who you thought of him as you went through there. And he looked at Flip's pictures and said, well, everybody's got these pictures. But Bates says, you're pretty good, and why don't you go out and shoot some more and come back again? So he went back out, and next year on his own, Flip was on his own as far as money and backing and all that. And Flip shot whales. He hit it off with some of the people from the whale research groups, and shot some more pictures, and went back and talked to Gilka, and Gilka says, mumble. That's the way he talks, and then he said, we'll give you some backing here, and he gave him a little bit of money, just enough so it covers some photo expenses, and then he gave him a couple of cameras to use, and were better than what he was using for me. And he went back, and the third time he went to Geographic, they said, okay, you're hired. And he's been working for Geographic ever since. And it worked out really well.
I'd say so. Speaking of Geographic, you, in your career, your amazing career, you've interacted with a lot of the greats, you being one of them yourself. So any juicy stories you want to share about David Dubélé, or I don't know, I'm guessing you also met Cousteau at some point, probably several times.
Yeah. David and I were good friends. David is an amazing photographer that goes at his own pace. And when I was working with David in Alaska and Hawaii a couple other times, I'd get up in the morning ready to go, and David would say, well, he's got to take a shower. He'd take a lot of time and read the morning paper, and I'd be pacing around saying, we got to be shooting. We worked in the Red Sea where Bates would have 3 cameras. No, maybe 5 cameras. He'd have a couple of still cameras in the housing and a couple of the early Calypsos. And my job with David was to shoot a picture of David once in a while if I could. But my job was basically to be his camera boy. And we'd leave those cameras up on the top of the cliff, and the cameras would have a little flag floating on them so that we could find them. And I'd run the cameras back and forth to David. David was shooting like crazy down, and we'd be 180 feet or something. We would do some really diving in those days. David was amazing. We did a series on the coral divers, black coral divers, but most of the coral was over on the other side near Lanai. Anyway, we'd go out with the black coral divers, and they were tough guys, and they thought we were wimps because we wanted to decompress and do all these kind of things that they sort of blow it off. Not professional. Well, anyway, the black coral divers would put up with us because we were more safety conscious than they were, and we didn't take as many chances. But we put on this party, and it got carried away. And the party went on and on and on, and David disappeared somewhere along the line. And I don't know if I slept on the sand on the beach that night or not, but we had some really exciting after diving parties.
Those are the best kind.
David's a good guy.
You know, now that there's more cameras in the water now than there ever have been before, and the quality is out of control. I've just upgraded my system. I'm using this new macro lens, which is making things look like they're from outer space. All that being said, you've seen these transitions. You've inspired some of these transitions, the technology growing, and your work is, on films that people have enjoyed for their entire lives.
And what happened? What happened is that all of a sudden the equipment became important. In the early days, the equipment was just whatever you could scrounge, but you were the important one. I mean, it took a lot of skill to get the good shots. And you had to hold the camera still, and you had to have the right lenses. And then nowadays, all you need is enough money to buy the right equipment and enough money to get somewhere and enough brains to realize that the guy just got there before you and shot the picture that you're trying to shoot. So you've lost a lot of the ability as an underwater cameraman, but you've got the ability to have the equipment. And as it gradually went from film to disc, some of us got to the point where maybe I'm 80 years old, and all of a sudden all the equipment is old-fashioned. You got to get new stuff, and the editing become not cut and film. It just, I hit it right. I got there at the earliest days, and I got there at the end days of filmmaking. Filmmaking, not just picture making, but using film to make the picture. About time for me to start doing something else anyway. I started just doing some of the books and stuff like that. You know how old I am?
No, I do not.
92.
92.
And I'll be 93 soon. And then after that, I'm going to be 94.
You darn tootin'. And you're still getting in the water, which is so impressive. I want to be like you. I want to be diving 50 years from now. That would be absolutely incredible. First of all, you did just mention your book, and I'd love everyone to read it. It's called Cameraman, Stories of My Life and Adventures as an Underwater Filmmaker. So for anyone interested, definitely check that out. I'm about to myself. But for a man who has had such a storied career, I want to give you the option or the moment to speak to the people listening about why the ocean is important. You've spent so much of your life in it and inspiring people around it. So I just want to give you a moment to speak to our audience about it.
Life is important because the ocean is important. It's the basics of our life, even if we don't believe it. You forget it, but I don't know. I know why the ocean is important to me. It's important to me because I don't want it to change. I don't want to see the whales all disappear. I don't want to have the rocks on the beach be barren of any life because we just killed everything in the ocean, which it kills everything along the ocean side. In the days at La Jolla Cove, my favorite place in the dive in the early days, or even would be now, the La Jolla Cove was full of lobsters and fish, and it was a great place to be, and yet it hasn't changed that much. The places where we've protected, where we've used intelligence, Yellowstone, any of those places where the animals have all come back. We're making a mistake trying to decide which ones can come back, but we need wolves, but we don't need all wolves. We don't need so many wolves that we don't have calves of bison. There's some intelligence has to be used in what's happening to our world. It's sad that things are going to change, but I'm not driving that same old blue Porsche. Things are going to change, and too bad that they change in some directions and ignoring other things that need change. But I'm 92, and there's not much I can do about it. I can be sad, and I can tell people I wish you'd do something, but there's not much I can do.
Well, you can share your story, which you've done very well, and I'm very appreciative of you spending the time. For all the photographers who are patting themselves on the back for how good the images they take are, I don't know if they have the concept of how hard you and your friends had to work to get the image back in the day.
It is so easy to take photographs underwater that is shown in a little tiny picture, that they can be cropped a dozen different ways. I think the whole idea of underwater photography has not advanced as well as it should. I think there should be more photography showing something happening, not just a pretty picture. I think photography is not doing its job as well as showing what's really happening and what the life is really like as it should, but that's the way it is. I really feel very, very lucky that I was in the days when it took more skill and quality, ability to make a living at it. And nowadays, no matter how good you are, you can't sell your stuff because the guy down the street shot it just because he had more money and more time to do it. It's not. Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, as a modern day underwater photographer, I know exactly what you're saying. There's more competition than ever, but that is why I, instead of just trying to get in the magazines, what I try and do is get those images to kids and help them understand the ecosystem. Because, like you're saying, an animal in action gives you perspective on how they live.
Yeah.
And that perspective is very important. It's not just about the aesthetic, the beauty of the shot. It's who is this creature? What are they doing?
Yeah. It's sort of not one of the best things to be 92 years old. But one of the best things about being 92 is if you can look back and see that you've made some changes and you've lived. I'm a guy that's 92 years old that feels he's lived a life that adds to the history of life, but he did it fairly and did it with a smile on his face. I've always been happy with what I'm doing. I'm always not always happy that the way the shot came out, but I'm happy that I was there and I can go back and do it again and maybe make it better. There's a lot of guys that spend their life wishing they were somebody else or wishing they were doing something else. I always wanted to be a cameraman. I didn't want to be a producer or a director. I wanted to get the best picture I could in the situation I was at. That was my challenge. And there's a lot of people who spend their life trying to be somebody they aren't or just make more money. And I'm pretty good the way it's gone.
I'd say so. And, I know what you mean. I know that challenge is always ever present because there's always the next shot and there's the difficulty of the situation. Maybe it's a little murky or, something's going wrong with your equipment, but yet you figure it out, you persevere, and you become the person you are because of it.
Yeah, that's my story.
Meet the Ocean is produced by Paul North and Andrew Gettings, with additional recording by Eric Waremeister and sound design by me, Kelsey Anderson. That's our episode. Many thanks to Chuck Nicklin for sharing his stories with us. Meet the Ocean is a listener-supported nonprofit. Consider donating a monthly $C on either our new website or Patreon page. Every grain of sand helps supply the demand. While you're clicking around, check out our multiple award-winning film, Winter in Antarctica, I promise it will be one cool adventure. Thanks again for sticking with us over the last 5 years. 3 cheers for 100 episodes. Until next time, may the saltwater be with you.
And now. Can I go deeper than that? Oh, God. I've been in Alaska working for 2 months. Forgive me.